Thank you, Andrew, for that very generous introduction. Thank you all for being here tonight. I always joke that when I've come to the library now for about 12 years, doing research from the time of my master's degree on, or when I speak at the Anderson House or for DAR chapters across the country, it's always a miracle I don't burst into flames, because my ancestors were all in the 64th and 71st Regiments of Foot in the Hessian Jägerkorps von Firm. And so, not a huge fan of that, obviously, but that we can't help who our ancestors are. And so I'd like to really thank the Massachusetts Society for the generous donation, allowing us to do this tonight, and just the Society broadly. It's always a treat to be back at Anderson House, to be able to sort of read and research in the most welcoming environment imaginable. So let's talk a little bit tonight about the nature of infantry battle during the American War of Independence. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, one that I think there is plenty of room for additional research on in the field, but one that I think, sadly, for most Americans and most Europeans, something that is on a popular level very poorly understood. We have a version of 18th century warfare in our minds, I think, that emphasizes the formality of 18th century warfare, the aesthetics of 18th century warfare. When we look at images like the images you see here on the slide, soldiers wearing laced uniforms, wearing cocked hats, wearing powdered wigs, or at least we say they're powdered wigs. Usually they're wearing their own hair long with powder. It can be difficult to take these soldiers seriously. I mean, how can we take seriously an army that fights in lace or wears powdered wigs? It's a world removed, I think, would say, from the more modern militaries of our own day, or even in the 19th century, in the American Civil War, where war appears a little bit more serious. I was just speaking at the Marine Corps University down in Quantico last week, and as part of an edited volume that a professor there is putting forth. And we finished the 18th century wars and got into the Napoleonic period. And he said, good, it's finally some real wars. And so often I think that is our perception of 18th century warfare, that it's not very serious, it's very formal, it's quite limited. But I'm hoping to tell you a story tonight of an 18th century warfare that is very deadly, very serious for these men who took part, an 18th century warfare that looks like men fighting in ways that don't seem alien to us, but instead make sense to us. As we try and grapple with this world, frequently we're led astray by both film and also comments from modern historians. And so if you watch, I imagine most of you in the audience have been tortured with the Mel Gibson film, The Patriot. If you watch films like this, you see a version of 18th century infantry combat that's very rigid. Soldiers kind of marching slowly into enemy fire. Soldiers marching into very close range, or at least from our perspective, very close range before firing at the enemy. Soldiers who are almost robotic. And of course, the GIFs here are not from The Patriot, but instead a Russian film called The Sovereign Servant, which depicts the Battle of Poltava in the Great Northern War in 1709. But if you envision that scene depicting the Battle of Camden in The Patriot, the British soldiers are sort of marching almost robotically, blank stares on their faces. This is the goal, I think, of many 18th century officers. They want an army that behaves like clockwork. George Washington uses that language of clockwork as he describes the Continental Army. This is an aspirational thing, and this is something that reading statements like this from Washington, films set in the 18th century, even historians writing about the 18th century, try to capture. Will they exchange volleys with the enemy at close range? And you can see the poor Swedes there getting annihilated by Russian firepower at close range. They don't take cover. They just stand there in ranks, getting shot down by the enemy. And then finally, almost by some imperceptible law of war, both sides say, okay, we fired enough. Let's do a mutual charge into hand-to-hand combat and resolve the fight with bayonets. This is a very formal picture of 18th century warfare. It's a very static picture of 18th century warfare, and it's not just the movies. It's easy to blame the movies. I was having a conversation with our library director earlier in the library downstairs, and we said historians are really only as persuasive as the straw mans that they can sort of set up to knock down. Well, I don't want you to just think this is the perception of 18th century warfare in film. I want to read you a passage from a really wonderful Napoleonic historian who knows the Napoleonic Wars very well, Professor Mike Legere, a phenomenal Napoleonic historian. But he's got this image of 18th century warfare in his mind, and it's leading him astray a little bit. So let me read this to you. Consequently, every aspect of a Frederican army, that's an 18th century army called after the King of Prussia, Frederick the Great, tactics, marching, logistics, was designed to prevent the individual from deserting. Tactically, the armies employed a linear system that emphasized thin, rigid, close order lines to maximize firepower through a closely supervised, cohesive infantry attack. Besides for possibly enabling desertion, woods and hills undermined the effectiveness of the volleys, broke linear cohesion, and limited the tactical control of the commanding general. Generals preferred to move their units slowly and methodically over open terrain. The entire army advanced as a unitary organism toward the enemy in a completely uniform manner. Firefights featured long, thin lines of three-rank deep infantry exchanging mass, unaimed volleys with the enemy. Well, as you're going to hear tonight, based on my research here at the library, in Europe, in other archives in both the United States and Canada, I have a different model of 18th century infantry battle. I think this model is quite outdated and does not match the sources that we have down in the library and in archives across the Atlantic world very well. And so you'll see this evening, I'm going to be describing a different sort of infantry battle in the 18th century. The sort of infantry battle where soldiers consider whether or not obeying their officers is the correct decision. The men aren't just robots. They exercise authority in a negotiated way on the battlefield with their officers. They aim their muskets at the enemy. Often they'll fight as skirmishers. I talked a little bit about that in the case of the Hessians the last time I was here at Anderson House last year in that panel on Don Hagist's book, Waging War in North America. They fire their muskets, not waiting for the officers to say, oh, it's time to fire a volley, but as fast as they've loaded, without waiting for words of command. They fire frequently at, from our perspective, relatively long range in the 18th century world, at ranges of 100 yards or longer. Imagine an American football field or a European football pitch in between the combatants. That's fairly normal. They frequently run on the battlefield, not marching slowly, methodically, but moving quickly, especially when they're under fire. Finally, they'll take cover when fired upon, and also they don't like to engage in melee combat. The bayonet for them is a weapon of intimidation. It's not something they relish getting into close combat and getting into melee combat with their opponents. So you can see aspects of this all across 18th century armies. But I want to start tonight with you all where I begin the book, and that is in the War of Polish Succession in the 1730s. To some extent, the talk tonight will have two parts. I want to broadly discuss what's the norm in 18th century European armies, and then we're going to transition to our war that we're preparing to celebrate the 250th anniversary of here in a few weeks, the American War of Independence. This painting by Jan Peter Verdassen depicts the Battle of Guastalla in northern Italy in 1734. And it's at battles like these over in Europe that as I began the process of my dissertation research almost a decade ago, I really thought, wow, I'm hearing things from the sources that don't match up well with our current model of how 18th century battle was fought. The following quote is from an Irish officer who's essentially been Germanized. He's fled Ireland and is fighting in the Austrian military. As a result, he has an absolutely delightful name, Johann Macquire von Innenskillen. He describes the Battle of Guastalla and the infantry firefight there as follows. We march slowly with bayonets fixed. Seems pretty normal so far. And when we were in the presence of the enemy, the prince ordered me to gallop from company to company and forbid on pain of death to fire without orders from him or from me. We make a bold front, march in good order, until we come within 150 paces of the enemy, when a grenadier fires and the others follow his example. The prince shouts, sabers them, he's hitting them with the flat of his sword, and makes incredible efforts to keep them from firing and get them to advance. Count Gruna and I likewise do the utmost of our ability. Prince Louis of Württemberg comes up, sabering them also, hitting them with the flat of his sword also, while performing the duty of a grenadier as well as that of a general. Towards 4 in the afternoon, we retired to the village. We were posted in the morning. No company mustered more than 10 men. Those wretches, he's describing his own soldiers here, who had nothing of the grenadier but the busby, the uniform, got themselves slaughtered miserably. Instead of giving one volley and falling on the enemy with the bayonet, we did not kill more than 30 of them, and our fire was of little service. So here you have an 18th century officer who's exasperated that the soldiers aren't fighting the way we see in the movies, that he would very much like the soldiers to fight the way that we see in the movies. Well, that's not happening. And you see that again and again across the 18th century world. Let's talk a little bit about the soldiers aiming their muskets. Often, as Americans, we have stories that we like to tell ourselves about the Revolutionary War. The idea that when Steuben came over to America, he instructed the men, well, don't level your pieces, aim your pieces. This idea that he invents the idea of aiming somehow, that aiming wasn't common in 18th century European warfare is quite untrue, I think. And we can see this in the infantry regulations, in some ways the paradigm army of the 18th century, Frederick's Prussia, the Prussian army of Frederick the Great. And you can see here two different sort of pieces from that infantry regulation. What does it say? The men must level well and take a good aim, firing without a hurry, right? The second passage, the men must take a good aim and look boldly into their fire. Officers are to be careful to make them level straight. The musket butt must rest even with the shoulders, and the men sink their heads a little in order to take a better aim. So this is, again, in many ways, if you have a perception of a robotic army in the 18th century, it probably is the Prussian army. The Prussian army is famed for its discipline under fire, for maneuvering in ways that are tightly controlled by the officers. Well, here, these robotic Prussians are being told to aim, and this is something we see again and again in the sources. Another German soldier, in this case a Braunschweiger, who's fighting sort of like the Hessians for the British in North America, talks about the importance of target practice before the battle. Making targets for each of his companies and having the men essentially see who the best shots are in the regiment, doing target practice in order to ensure the men are aiming. Frequently, again, in terms of myths that we often tell ourselves, we say it's pointless to aim weapons like this. They don't have a front sight, they don't have a back sight. How could you possibly aim an 18th century musket? And perhaps surprisingly, that's only true of British muskets. Prussian muskets, Dutch muskets, Swedish muskets in the 18th century frequently do have a back sight and a front sight on them. If you're ever out in Ligonier, Pennsylvania, there's an incredible museum where a lot of these muskets are preserved, and you can see the aiming apparatus that these weapons include. But even in the case of the British Army, that is manufacturing weapons without these aiming aids, the soldiers are adding them themselves. They're filing the tang of the musket barrel and making a back sight on their muskets. And I am delighted to be able to actually say this to you tonight. In the next room, in the exhibit that the Society has put on to celebrate the beginning of the Revolutionary War, there's an example of a musket from the 7th Regiment of Foot, which fought up in Canada, were captured down in Cowpens. This musket has one of those filed back sights. You can see it on the tang of the musket. If you're interested, please go check this out after the talk tonight. It's an incredible piece of 18th century history, when even where the soldiers are not being given this sort of aid by their state, they're sort of providing it themselves. All right. Now, Let's talk a little bit about independent fire. Soldiers not waiting for their officers to give the command to fire, not trading volleys with the enemy, but instead firing as fast as they possibly can. This is a comment from the very end of the 18th century. Johann Gottfried Hoyer is writing this in his sort of treatise on the art of war in 1799. And he's surveying the history of the 18th century and says, what are some of the major drawbacks in European armies? Well, the fact that we cannot bring common soldiers under control and build an unfeeling shooting machine. Build a robot, right? I mean, this is how these soldiers look frequently in modern film. Hoyer here says this is not happening. We can't do this. The men are firing independently. He talks about the dreaded Plackerfeuer, is what the Germans call an independent fire, or a fire where the men are loading as fast as they possibly can and then discharging their muskets without waiting for words of command. It's endemic on European battlefields. Firing without orders is a problem that most officers address in their 18th century treatises. You see this in the British Army in the 1740s. The British Army is supposedly famous for its ability to conduct with the Prussians platoon firing. That is to say, roughly an eighth or a fourth of the battalion will give fire at a particular time. The advantages that this brings are that a reserve of loaded muskets is always present. If the unit is charged or, say, attacked by enemy cavalry, there are always soldiers who could potentially be ready to fire, even as other comrades in the unit are giving fire. Well, this is the ideal, but in real life, the British find this very difficult to perform. And so you see comments, in court-martials, a British officer at a court-martial giving his opinion on a battle during the War of Austrian Secession. I shall only add the fire of our foot was infamous. Puff, puff. He's almost like he's on car talk here, describing the sound of the event that he's trying to sort of communicate to the audience. The men are just firing as fast as they possibly can. No platoon that I heard. Although I heard others who were in action near the right say they heard two. So maybe they were able to do this once or twice before the firing breaks down. Another officer, a sort of regimental or battalion level officer, sort of waiting for the action at the Battle of Fontenoy. A more senior officer rides by the battalion, and he essentially goes up to this more senior officer and asks, how should we engage the enemy? Should we fire by platoons? Or should we fire by ranks? Well, the senior officer replies, as to platoon or rank firing, I should be glad to see you perform either in action, but I own that I never did yet on a field day or at a review. So on the peacetime drill square, it's very possible to fire in these very complicated manners. But on 18th century battlefields, the men are firing as fast as they possibly can. They're in an incredible amount of stress. It's relatively difficult for them to perform these complicated firings by platoon, division, rank, things like this. I'm not going to read the entirety of this quote, but it's just more evidence from the War of Austrian Succession that essentially the men, both in the French army, the British army, the Austrian army, are firing at will as fast as they possibly can. They're stooping low when they're reloading and then standing up to give fire. It's an absolutely fascinating description, and to some extent, I think it exaggerates the effectiveness of the fire, but I think it's a fairly accurate description of the quality of the fire that's being given. It's equally true in our American War. Thomas Anbury, who's a soldier with Burgoyne's army in 1777, really in some ways gives the thesis of my book at the beginning of this quote. In action, that is actual combat, I found the manual exercises but an ornament, and the only object of importance it can boast was the loading, firing, and charging with bayonets. As to the form, the soldier should be instructed in the best and most expeditious, the quickest method. Here I cannot help but observing to you whether it proceeded from an idea of self-preservation or natural instinct, but the soldiers greatly improved the mode that they were taught in as to expedition. For as soon as they had primed their pieces and put the cartridge into the barrel, instead of ramming it down with rods, they struck the butt end of their piece on the ground, and bringing it to the present, fired it off. So Here he's saying that soldiers are engaging in a process of what we sometimes in the modern world call tap loading. The Austrians do this in the Battle of Mollwitz in 1741. It also seems that the British Army is sort of falling into this practice here in 1777. Now, I think in some ways the most enduring vision of 18th century warfare is the soldiers marching slowly, almost inexorably into close range, to the beating of drums, in cadence with one another. And in reality, you see a lot of descriptions in the sources that when the rubber meets the road, the men are not afraid to run on the battlefield, not just away from the enemy, but also to more advantageous positions. A French soldier in the Picardy Brigade during the battles of the War of Polish Succession recalls that the Picardy Brigade, posted at the right, was summoned to move to the center where the fighting was heavy. They ran almost as in a race, the quickest arriving first, and gave new strength to those already in the fight. In the case of the Prussian army, again, in some ways, perhaps the most tightly controlled 18th century army, we have an officer from a Fusilier regiment describing the fighting at the Battle of Prague on May 6, 1757. And he says, in order to reach the position of advance, we had to pass a long dam. Noblemen have created a fish pond, basically, a dam to sort of impede the progress of a stream, which delayed us. So in order to arrive at the correct time, we had to run past the village of Arnhem. And he adds almost sheepishly, the regiment was not in perfect order. The Austrian enemy were advancing on us at the quick step, and we engaged them. Another Prussian soldier, a member of the 9th Musketeer Regiment, Johann Jakob Dominicus, notes at the Battle of Kunersdorf that we had to run with energy in order to get under the enemy guns. So they're being shot at by artillery. They're trying to run out of the way of that line of fire. So this quick movement on the battlefield doesn't happen in all times, in all places, but the soldiers absolutely do move quickly on the battlefield when the situation demands it. Now, as far as taking cover on the battlefield, this is something that, again, our stereotypical picture of 18th century warfare usually does not take into account, especially in America. Our popular narrative, I'm sure, members of the society and those here tonight with us are aware this isn't quite accurate, but the idea that the Americans, like Mel Gibson and the Patriot, hid behind trees and picked off those crazy Brits who were standing out in the open field with their red coats on. Well, in actuality, in both 18th century Europe and 18th century North America, soldiers in both European armies and the Continental Army are frequently taking cover on the battlefield. The Comte de Guibert, in his general essay on tactics, notes that in battles like the Battle of Parma and the Battle of Guastalla, basically the soldiers are sort of kneeling to fire, as the regulation describes, and they never get back up. They just continue fighting the whole battlefield sort of on their knees. He says, I disagree with allowing the first rank to kneel. At the battles of Parma and Guastalla, almost all of our infantry and the Austrians, so both the French and the Austrians, fought in this manner. The British, particularly in Europe, are famed for taking cover on the battlefield. There are many examples from wars like the War of Austrian Succession. Here at the Battle of Fontenoy, you have the Scots, which will eventually be the Royal Highland Regiment of the 42nd. Well, how do they fight? Sir Robert, who's the officer there in the middle of this painting, this is not a period painting, obviously, from the 19th to 20th centuries. Sir Robert ordered the whole regiment to clap to the ground, that is, to throw themselves on the ground on receiving the French fire. And instantly, as soon as it was discharged, they sprang up and, coming close to the enemy, poured in their shot among them. So here you have a situation where there's almost an alternative method of the enemy's firing on us, let's take cover, then the enemy having fired will spring up and fire ourselves. I will also say The longer version of this quote notes that Sir Robert does not throw himself to the ground because he was too fat to pick himself up. And looking at this painting, I mean, if this man is too fat to pick himself up off the ground, I think there's been maybe some weight inflation since the middle part of the 19th century. I mean, who among us can stand if this is someone who's very heavy set in the 18th century? Now, the same battle, a sort of soldier in the British foot, not in the Scottish regiment. Samson Staniforth notes, "We marched up boldly, but when we came close to the town of Fontenoy, we observed a large battery, an enemy artillery battery, ready to be opened on us. And the cannon were loaded with small bullets, like canisters, essentially what he's describing. We had orders to lie on the ground, that is, to throw themselves to the ground, not be made a target for this artillery. But for all that, many were wounded and some killed. Presently, after the discharge, we rose up and marched, still keeping up our fire." So again, you have a situation where the French are preparing to fire, the English throwing themselves to the ground, realizing they're about to become a target for enemy action. Not just something the Scottish are doing, also something that I would say the entire British Army in these battles in the 1740s engages in. Now, in the American War, or at least in the 1770s, you see descriptions like this all over. You'll hear a couple more before the end of the lecture, but I do just want to read you Thomas Glynn. He's an officer in the Brigade of Guards. "My gallant friend, now no more, Captain Shaw of the 4th Company, was ordered by me to make his men lie down and cover themselves with brushwood as much as possible, to prevent them being seen as marks." So not only are you lying on the ground, it's almost as if, I think, what we view happens commonly in American Civil War combat, where the men are almost like entrenching as soon as they've stopped, is occurring here in the 17th centuries, and not just the Americans doing this, also our British opponents. Now, I'm going to turn from discussions of European militaries broadly to look at what's happening specifically in both the British and American forces, or the British Army and the Continental Army, in the course of the American War of Independence. Obviously, this is Xavier Delegato's famous picture of the Battle of Germantown in October of 1777. And it's also, perhaps as you might notice on your way out, the cover of my book. Germantown is probably the most famous example in the course of the American War of the British using cover, using a sort of a fortified position. They run into Cliveden, or the Chew House, about 120 soldiers under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Musgrave. And so it's, I think, a perfect example of this style of fighting. I was with the Chew, at the Chew House with my wife over July 4th last year, and talking with some of the curators there. They said, "Man, we hate this image. They get all the details of the house wrong." Well, I appreciate that. It's not particularly accurate in terms of the architectural style of Cliveden, but I do find it fascinating what's going on here with Xavier Delegato. I mean, he's an Italian artist. He's painting the houses he knows. But going to the court in places like Turin, Xavier Delegato would have seen images like those that we've already seen in this slide presentation. This is a depiction of the Battle of Parma. And obviously, in a military context, he's painting houses very similar to, he sees these examples of structures being used in a battlefield setting and says, well, I'll make Cliveden look a little bit like that. I think that's really what's going on here. In terms of the rest of the depiction, it's an incredibly accurate and more gifted historians than I, like Greg Irwin at Temple University, have even gone so far as identifying individual soldiers in this painting. It's a very, I think, good depiction of 18th century warfare of the tactical nature. And of course, there you see the light infantrymen going into the house. Okay, what is the British Army? What are their tactical doctrines in the American War of Independence? Well, contrary to our perception, say the Patriot, or even maybe paintings of the Battle of Bunker Hill, for the majority of the American War of Independence, I would say from 1776 on, the British are fighting in a two-rank open order style. They have opened up their files, so there's the distance of about an arm between each soldier. They're carrying their firelocks down at the trail as opposed to up at the shoulder, and they're moving in a very quick, sort of almost like a jog. This is not the traditional story of the British Army in the American War of Independence, where the British are sort of crammed in like sardines, getting picked off by American marksmen as they are sort of slowly working their way up to our positions. They're not fighting this war as a European war. They're not out of their depth in America. There's a reason why it's so difficult for General and future President Washington to win so many of the tactical encounters that he fights in the American War of Independence is because the British Army is a flexible, aggressive, and adaptable force. They are capable of defeating us quite handily on the battlefield in this more flexible, open style of fighting. They are, in terms of how the officers are thinking, they're breaking up the battle line. They're fighting in a more flexible way, almost like individual battalions, fighting individual battles in the course of some of these fights in the American War of Independence. And so, particularly for junior officers, this is something that requires a lot of them. It's a little bit more complex to manage a battle like this than the fighting that goes on in Europe. Well, the British are used to this style of war. It's something that they have been doing for some time in North America. In many ways, they're kind of knocking the rust off of their tactical model from the later years of the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War in North America. And here you can see some reenactors of the 7th Regiment of Foot down in the Carolinas depicting this open order style formation. Notice the gaps between these individual soldiers, right? It's not all packed together like sardines. They're not formed 3 ranks deep. This is the way that the British Army fights the American War of Independence, and it makes Washington's task much more difficult. In many ways, if the overall story of 18th century warfare is a story of flexibility and adaptability for infantrymen, the British Army is more flexible than most, and that makes our task of defeating them even harder. I want to close out sort of this section on the British with 2 quotes from Baron Riedesel, or Freiherr de Riedesel. He is, as I think I've already said tonight, a soldier from Brunswick or Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttel, who's fighting alongside the British eventually in the Burgoyne campaign, but up in Canada. And so this is the tail end of the fighting of the American invasion of Canada in 1775 and 1776. And he describes a skirmish between British forces and their American opponents in Canada near Three Rivers. So the brigadier went to meet them on the road to Montreal and came across their column. The Americans are advancing. He halted and gave orders for one of the English regiments to lie down, and in this position send one well-placed volley after another at the enemy whilst unseen themselves. This was all the more successful as it was in a dense forest where they met the rebel column. The enemy took flight in the utmost confusion at this unexpected firing and hastened back to the water. So again, in this case, I mean, if we're comparing our notes here to the Hollywood version of the American War of Independence, the British are Mel Gibson, and we are the ones getting sort of picked off. It's a very flexible, adaptable army, and Riedesel goes on to explain in his journal why the British are fighting like this. He gives us, in some ways, the philosophy that underpins their decision to fight in this manner. But the English make it one of their chief rules and principles in this country that no maneuvers may ever be carried out in serried ranks, of course, where the troops are all crammed together, in these districts that are so terribly wooded. They found that out to their cost in the last war against the French in North America, in which they were always unsuccessful at the commencement until they taught their men to maneuver with open ranks and cover themselves by means of trees, after which they were always successful. So this is in some ways, sort of learning the lessons of the French and Indian War, learning the lessons of the early part of that war, where the British were not very successful fighting against the French and their Native American allies. And here, by the time we get to the American War of Independence, they've learned this lesson a couple times. And so they're very able and ready to fight against the Continental Army in methods that make a lot of sense here in North America. Now, of course, This is not my original research. It comes by an absolutely incredible book by a British scholar named Matthew Spring. If you've not read his tome on how the British Army tactically fights the American War of Independence, I would say go out and order this book tonight. It is absolutely a revisionist work of history, and I say that in a very positive way, in the sort of a true historian paying a compliment to another. He's gone into the archives, he's done the legwork in order to revise how historians think about the American War of Independence. Not an easy task, and a very impressive product. So, all of this to say, the British are a bit more flexible, a little bit more adaptable than we might initially think we might like to give them credit for. Well, that's them. What about us? How do we fight the American War of Independence? I'm working on a book now that I hope will be out perhaps in time for the anniversaries in 1777, so in 2027, that describes American tactical philosophies in the War of Independence. What are George Washington and Gates and General Greene, how do they think about the tactical problems they face on these very dangerous battlefields in the 18th century? Well, my title, or the current working title, comes from a letter of John Adams to Abigail. And he closes out this letter by sort of describing the American philosophy as they prepare for war in the spring of 1777. America is universally convinced of the necessity of meeting them's the British in this case, in the field, in firm battalion, and American fire is terrible. So the Americans, as opposed to the British in the War of Independence, who fight in a very quick-moving style, trying to intimidate us with bayonets so that we will flee the battlefield, firepower is the linchpin that Americans are resting their hopes on. Firepower is what will, in Washington's mind, save the Continental Army at some of the sort of its darker moments in the American War of Independence. It's not a story of necessarily firepower with rifles. Riflemen are very important in the early years of the war. They're very important at engagements like Boston, to some extent, obviously in the Southern campaign. But a British veteran of the 7 Years' War, who subsequently has retired to North America and is giving us maybe the perspective of a loyalist on the imperial crisis in 1775, notes that the Americans really believe that their riflemen, their skill at arms, the accuracy with which they fire, the ideal of the American rifleman will set them apart from the British. This is their hope. He notes the Americans, whose army was composed of raw peasants, talking about the British here, who know not the use of arms, the lower class, these British peasants, being deprived of their use by an act of Parliament, while the patriots of America were marksmen from their youth. In short, by the inventions of designing men, the people's imaginations were essentially inflamed to a point where, man, they think because of our riflemen, because we didn't grow up like these British soldiers who don't have a gun culture, who don't have a culture of firearms, we're going to be successful. It'll be easy for us to win the revolution. This is the hope. This is the sort of American outlook as we move towards the fighting in 1775. In a passage right before this, this sort of British veteran, he says, they're distributing pamphlets telling the American people that this is the case. They're trying to encourage us that we'll be able to defeat the British Army because we are skilled in the use of arms and they are not. Well, of course, I imagine we all know the vast majority of American soldiers don't use rifles. They use the same sort of flintlock weapons that the British employ. And I would say if there are some innovations that Americans bring to the vast majority of their firepower, we prefer to fire ammunition like the ammunition you see in the top right of this slide, which is a large, perhaps 70 caliber musket ball, but it has a buckshot attached to it from when it's come out of the barrel. Americans love to use an ammunition load that, of course, in the modern context, we call buck and ball, which is perhaps 3 buckshot in addition to this larger caliber musket ball. This is very effective. This does go a long way towards maybe making up for some of the inadequacies of the flintlock weapon. It does produce more casualties upon the British as they're coming in towards us at many of these battlefields. And so adapting, this isn't an entirely new idea. Oddly enough, the Russian army also really prefers to use buckshot as it fights in the 7 Years' War. The Russians load 9 buckshot in addition to their musket balls. So it's not a completely American tactical practice, but it is something that we adopt from an early point of the war, and Washington particularly thinks this is the right way to engage the British. General Gates, right before the Battle of Saratoga, is writing essentially to his logisticians saying, we need more buckshot. We don't have enough buckshot to make up the cartridges we need to fight this battle. It's a very important part of our overall philosophy of engaging the British. But more importantly than the technology that we're using, the Americans, led by Washington, have a tactical philosophy. A philosophy that emphasizes close range fire. Washington firmly believes that the right way to wage a battle is to wait, and of course, perhaps we're familiar with this language from Bunker Hill, wait until you see the whites of their eyes, wait until you see the enemy up close. An American soldier, Joseph Plum Martin, who I'm sure many of you here tonight have read, notes at the Battle of Germantown, we had orders not to fire until we could see the buttons on their coats, trying to ensure that the enemy is close enough for the firepower to truly be effective. George Washington, in the run-up to the Battle of Long Island in the summer of 1776, kind of outlines his tactical philosophy for how the Americans should fight this war. All soldiers will behave with coolness and bravery and will not throw away their fire. The general recommends for them to first fire with 1 musket ball and 4 to 8 buckshot according to the size and strength of their pieces. If the enemy are received with such a fire at not more than 20 or 30 yards distance, he has no doubt of their being repulsed. So in some ways, Washington here is arguing for a version of 18th century warfare that looks a little bit more like the Hollywood version that we started out with. The officers would love for the men to hold their fire into really close range. The trouble is that demands a huge amount of psychological sort of bravery from the infantrymen who are on the receiving end of this British advance. I mean, imagine a British battalion of 400 men with 18-inch long bayonets jogging at you at 20 yards away. You're going to be petrified. And so as a result, our soldiers do sometimes struggle to fulfill Washington's vision. He writes about this again and again. Just a few weeks after this emphatic explanation, Washington reminded Brigadier General William Livingston, quote, caution the officers and soldiers against firing at great distances, an error to which young troops are much exposed, and which occasions a great waste of ammunition. In August, right before the Battle of Long Island, the general orders contain 2 references to holding fire at close range, the second of which reads, be cool, but determined. Do not fire at a distance. Washington is determined that the men should try and hold their fire into close range. Well, and you'll see a chart here in a moment, but Washington was frequently distressed that Americans did not follow through on this sort of tactical recommendation. And I would say experienced increasing distress over his soldiers' lack of coolness. Coming close to despair at the end of the Philadelphia campaign, Washington wrote to James Varnum on November 11th, 1777, it is greatly wished that all firing might be prevented, except where there is a real necessity and the distance such might as promise a good effect. So man, we could just get the soldiers to not shoot at all until they're in really close range. That would be the way to win the Revolutionary War. Well, again, this is a tough thing to do. It's a tough thing to do for soldiers who have been in the army for years over in Europe. These French and Austrian soldiers that we met at the beginning of the lecture tonight. who have been in the Army frequently 3 or 4 years with a lot of training struggle to do this. They're firing at 150 paces. Well, that's far in excess of Washington's recommendation. So perhaps unsurprisingly, again and again, Washington is disappointed when these American Continentals take, in my opinion, the very reasonable step of opening fire at a greater distance to try and slow down that British advance. So what's the result? How well do we follow through on Washington's vision? Well, I've examined here 25 descriptions of firefight ranges in archival documents in both Britain and the United States. Where are Continental soldiers actually opening fire on the enemy? Well, I mean, you can sort of see a bit of it for yourself there, but only in about 6 of these 25 cases do the Continentals follow through on Washington's recommendation. That is to say, hold your fire until the enemy is 30 yards or closer than 30 yards. Much more frequently, the soldiers are firing at normal European distances, between 30 and 80 yards, over 80 yards, 100 yards, or even greater distances. This is a real headache for Washington, whose soldiers are going into battle with less ammunition than his British opponents. At many battles of the Revolutionary War, battles like Germantown and Eutaw Springs, successful American attacks stall not because the troops aren't brave enough, they're not sort of willing to go into action, but because they run out of ammunition. Washington is sort of riding through the battlefield at Germantown and sort of comments to his staff officers, General Sullivan is throwing away his fire. He's firing too rapidly. The men are firing too quickly. We're not going to have enough ammunition to sustain this assault. There's a major logistical headache created by this tendency to fire at long range. And I think in Washington's defense, it is worth saying that at battles like the Cowpens in 1781, we win great tactical victories in the War of Independence when we manage to follow through on this recommendation, right? When John Eager Howard waits until the enemy comes within 25 yards before delivering a volley. That's a volley that stuns the British forces, that enables an American counterattack to sweep the field. So to a large extent, I think Washington is following best tactical practices in his vision for how the War of Independence should be fought, but he is not able to train the men, at least in the early stages of the war, where a lot of the important northern field battles are occurring, in order to follow through on his tactical vision. Thank you so much for your attention tonight. I look forward to your questions.
Yes, excellent presentation today. I'm interested in your perspectives on British General William Howe. Before the Revolution, he reportedly developed new light infantry tactics. Were those tactics successful in America, and how would you compare them to the Prussian light infantry tactics?
Certainly. So to answer maybe the first part of your question first, and then move on to the second. How is, he's not a tactician on the level of Napoleon, but in some ways it's his vision that Dr. Spring is describing in Zealand Bay, and that's only. This light infantry maneuvers that are first practiced in Ireland and then adapted to the American regiments are not just something the light infantry is doing, but is deployed throughout the army as a whole. And this is one of actually the areas of criticism that Dr. Spring puts it at the British Army in the War of Independence, is all of their troops are fighting in essentially the same way. The light infantry are just fighting in the same adaptable way that the rest of the military is fighting. It produces incredible tactical results in the early years of the war. As the war goes on, there are British generals, and particularly General Clinton, I think, is in this mold where he says it's a really sort of almost like haphazard way of fighting the enemy. There's not a lot of sort of solid lines, and as a result, as the enemy, the Continental or sort of our troops are increasing in quality, it's increasingly risky for the British to try and pull this off. And so that's, in my opinion, what leads to disasters. I mean, I know that Monmouth Courthouse is a disaster for the British, but they're stopped, right? At Cowpens, they run into disaster. At Guilford Courthouse, they take horrendous losses. Not necessarily because they're not fighting in a way that makes sense, but because at battles like the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, different British battalions break through the second line at different points. And so they approach the third line almost independently and probably take more losses than they might otherwise have done. As far as how it compares to the Prussian army over in Europe, the Prussian military doesn't open up the files like this. It is sort of a much more rigid army in some ways in terms of its tactical deployments. You have a three-rank line, a line in close order. With that said, as this sort of fight continues, both the Hessians and likely the Prussians over in Europe are training their soldiers to maybe solve this problem of light infantry in woods in a different way. And that is to say, the main body of the battalion is still closed up in serried ranks, men arm in arm. But they send out skirmishers almost in a Napoleonic way. The Hessians are famous for doing this, especially in the battles of the 1776 campaign. And maybe we can talk after the lecture, and I can point you to a YouTube video where I discuss this process in that context. The Prussians also do this in the War of Bavarian Succession. It's running concurrent with our American War of Independence. So a slightly different answer to this problem, but a way that Hessian generals like General Hagist, I think, are very effective in North America.
Hi, this was terrific. A question about the Battle of Oriskany. You know, Leger obviously had these, both the natives and the militia, plus some British soldiers that really ambushed Herkimer and in that ravine. It's quite remarkable. I went and visited it last summer. And I think you almost felt like, wow, this should have been the Americans doing that to the British, not vice versa. So I think it plays into your thoughts, you know, that they weren't exactly just sitting out in the middle of the field waiting to be shot. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Oriskany is a fascinating battle. You have loyalists, Native Americans, maybe a few British soldiers, but also German Jaeger, German riflemen who are there. And so this force is actually a fairly effective force to be fighting in the deep woods of the upper country, right? There are, I mean, I don't want us necessarily to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think especially in the South, there are instances where the Americans are ambushing the British, are more effective at fighting in woodland environments than maybe loyalists are, who are fighting alongside the British. But frequently, I mean, comments like that from Baron Riedesel, and then also obviously experiences like Oriskany. It's not always us ambushing them. In many ways, this is a war where two armies have fairly similar tactical models, and they're sort of engaging each other on more or less an equal footing. The British aren't always the ones being discomforted by our skill at fighting in woods.
I had a question about this notion that the American frontiersman was a superior fighter in this context here, and but from what you said, the British sort of came along. Although, you know, the movies, they show, you know, the frustration of the British officers of how it's sort of very sort of unmanly and hiding behind trees and killing their troops. But I wondered if it did make a difference, or did these British soldiers sort of rise to the same level through experience, or do you think it was a critical factor, this sort of background of the American soldiers?
That's an excellent question. So I would say the Americans do have some advantages. We have more riflemen than the British do. And maybe not in large field battles, but in the War of Posts, where we're outside New York City and they're inside New York City, and our forces are skirmishing back and forth, having rifles does give you a powerful advantage, especially in the early part of the war, which is fascinating because in the early part of the war, there are more riflemen as compared to the entire American Army in 1775 and 1776 and the rest of the war. Washington reduces the number of riflemen in his army as the war goes on. But in that early phase of the war, riflemen are a powerful psychological advantage. Western riflemen wearing hunting shirts or maybe even in Indian-style dress are absolutely intimidating to the British. They concern British officers. Now, I do think the movies probably overplay the idea of this sort of ungentlemanly nature of targeting the enemy's officers. Everyone's doing this. The British at the Battle of Eutaw Springs in 1781, in September of 1781 in South Carolina, British enlisted men with smoothbore weapons are picking off our officers from about 100 yards away. It's something the British do in a war that I spend a lot of time sort of thinking and researching about, the 7 Years' War over in Europe, when Frederick of Prussia is kind of fighting against his Austrian enemies. There are Jaeger sort of parceled out and attached to the various battalions. These are rifle-armed troops kind of firing short Germanic rifles. They explicitly target enemy officers. And there's a comment from a lieutenant, Lieutenant Ernst von Barsewicz at the Battle of Liegnitz in 1760, where he specifically says, you know, Jaeger in my company, I want you to pick off that colonel from his horse. So, you know, when it comes to the head of state, you might want to kill the enemy general, you might want to kill the enemy king, but if you're just firing against an enemy colonel, you're probably targeting him fairly explicitly, at least before the smoke generated by these weapons makes it fairly hard to do so.
Did the Americans ever adopt the bayonet, and what significance does that have?
Absolutely. American troops frequently, you hear the myth, and this is going to sort of hurt the people from my university where Steuben is the mascot. Frequently you hear that only after Steuben do we adopt the bayonet, only then do we sort of match the British in sort of this, you know, bayonet for bayonet. That's really not true. There are absolutely Americans fighting with fixed bayonets from 1776 on. Do they love doing it? At Lafayette, you know, gets wounded at Brandywine essentially because he's trying to get the men to go in close with the bayonet, and they're more hesitant to do this. So I do think Steuben improves our effectiveness late in the war at battles like Eutaw Springs, during the Yorktown campaign. Washington issues orders of the day that says, I don't want the men to fire at all. I want them to advance at a trot, you know, towards the British with their bayonets, just like they're coming in at us. So he's trying to kind of match the British in this same method of fighting. By the end of the war, Otho Holland Williams, who's a beautiful portrait in the next room, he notes at the Battle of Eutaw Springs, he's very, very proud. The Americans go forward and the Maryland troops break the British line by just advancing with bayonets and without firing. This, in his mind, in the minds of Washington and these other Continental officers, this is a sign the American Army has become as proficient as the British. They're capable of breaking them in the same way that in 1776 and 77, often American troops were broken in the face of British bayonet advances.
You mentioned earlier about the lack of a front and back sight on the British muskets. Was that intentional? There was not the goal of aimed individual fire, just wait a volley, or what was the purpose of that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I do not have the answer for you in terms of why it's present on Prussian and Swedish and sort of Saxon muskets and is not present on British muskets. The Dutch in particular are famed for having a very pronounced front sight on the front of these muskets. It's possible it's a cost-saving measure, but it's something I would have to do more research on. I would say when you're examining British muskets, like the musket in the next room, perhaps 40% of the time you do see these back sights filed on. So it's something that happens fairly commonly, but it is not something that they are produced with. Why does that happen? That's something I would have to research more in order to give you a complete answer.
So you have a lot of examples of men not listening to their officers. What does effective battleship leadership look like in this context?
Absolutely. So this is something that I detail at length in the book. It looks like positive examples. There's a German officer, actually a Braunschweiger, like Riedesel, who fights in the 7 Years' War, the hereditary prince of Brunswick. And he comments, soldiers like it when officers are always with them, when they're out with them in the outposts, when they're sort of there with them in the camp. He says, go to the front of wherever the fighting is happening and be with your soldiers until you die alongside them. And the phrase that he's writing in French, even though he's a German, the phrase that he uses in French sounds very much like sort of till death do us part, almost like a marriage contract, right? This is, I'm not trying to implicate that, 18th century officers are married to their men. But when you have this positive example of leadership, the men respond very well to it. There are many examples I kind of go on at length in the book during attacks in sort of the small war. There's an officer from Ansbach-Bayreuth who he's a grenadier officer, so already kind of with an assault unit. He is leading his troops forward to attack an American redoubt. He's shot badly in the arm. By the sort of standards of the day, it would be perfectly acceptable for him to withdraw from the battlefield and seek medical attention. And he says, no, my men are still out here getting killed. I'm going to continue sort of leading in the advance. 5 minutes later, he's shot and killed, but his soldiers don't run away. They continue and take the redoubt. By contrast, over in Prussia, an officer named Johann Jakob Lemke at the Battle of Polzig in 1759, his men are kind of hunkered down behind trees being bombarded by enemy artillery. And he really wants to launch an attack to go take the enemy guns. Well, he's not leading from the front. His method of leadership is kind of like we saw in the initial quote, hit the men with the flat of your sword and tell them to get out there and do it. Well, the men say, nah, officer, we're not going to go out and get slaughtered by that artillery. You hit us all you want, but we're not going anywhere. Then a round shot skips through and breaks his left ankle. He sort of tumbles to the ground and all the men leave him there and he gets captured by the Russians. So again, I'm not trying to say, all Prussian officers like this. There are many examples and many in the book of Prussian officers sort of leading heroically from the front. But when you lead in a more positive way, the men respond positively to this example. And I mean, just think of the death of Wolfe at Quebec, or the death of Field Marshal Kurt Christoph von Schwerin at the Battle of Prague in 1757. I mean, examples like this are all throughout 18th century warfare and usually associated with fairly positive results for the attacking side.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. How would you rate the performance of the French infantry, the one that arrived under Rochambeau in June 1780, Newport, Rhode Island, and then marched 660 miles in 14 weeks, and then jointly, actually more French soldiers and officers fought in Yorktown than Americans. So how do they mesh their strategy, and how do they compare to the other forces?
That's an excellent question, and something that I both was talking with Professor Robert Seelig when I was here last time, Bob Seelig, and then also with some of my friends online over the past few weeks, that's come up. The French don't open up their files in the same way as the British. I don't know why that's the case. I've asked Bob Seelig, and his comment is, we don't fight any major field battles. Why would we open up the files? I think that's, maybe taking it a little bit too far. It's possible they are sort of following this Hessian or Prussian method of keeping the battalions closed and sending out skirmishers. That's something I would have to look into more. I would say that is common among the French military in the later years of the 7 Years' War. You see French military maps that denote the positions of skirmishers coming from the line regiments in the 18th century French army in the middle of the 18th century. But in terms of how the soldiers perform, they do quite well. They fight effectively in the War of Posts. Their light cavalry is quite effective in sort of helping us during the Yorktown campaign. Just because they don't fight in a sort of a major field battle like Monmouth Courthouse doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't effective soldiers who would have performed well, I think, in sort of a showdown like that against the British.
Alex, I got a question for you.
Okay.
You spoke a lot about the adaptability of the British Army here tonight, and that made me remember at Brandywine the when the British were charging across Birmingham Hill, they were at a quick march, beating the drums of the British Grenadiers. And the Hessian Grenadiers that were in reserve never made it to that action on time because they were just like slowly, methodically marching. That seemed like a major disconnect.
Yeah,
Did this
absolutely.
happen frequently between the two armies, and what problems did that occur, and did we play off of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, to some extent, Dr. Springs addressed that in New Zealand Bayonets, only talking about the way that the British are moving in this fast manner, and the Hessians are a little bit more solid. They're not moving quite as quickly. The British officers at the time note this, and they sort of give the Hessians a hard time about it. One British officer notes in his defense, kind of almost like in a broken way, trying to reproduce the guy's German accent. The German comments, well, the British are the devil for going on, but the Hesse man is the soldier. So, we're a little bit more solid. If you all want to go run around in the battlefield, that's great. We'll get there when we get there, and we'll be effective fighting when we get there. It sounds kind of like an excuse to me. I do think if you look at the performance of Hessian units, like at the first Battle of Savannah, when the British under Stuart are trying to take Savannah, the British actually struggle to assault the American position. It's not until the regiment, I think it's Trumbach at that point, comes up, and with the solid firepower they possess, sort of being all packed together, they're able to drive the Americans off the battlefield. So I would say there's a give and take. Other Germans, the Braunschweigers that with Riedesel that I referenced a couple times in the course of this lecture, they say, no, we're going to fight the same way the British do. And there are incredible descriptions of, in the year before Saratoga, Braunschweigers and sort of Hessians from Hanau or Hesse-Hanauers, they are jogging and like doing like PT, basically doing like cardio alongside British soldiers in the winter. And they're like, this is weird. We don't really do this a lot. I'm not sure why the British are doing this. What's the thinking behind this? So they kind of respond to it in different ways. The Hessians, the Hessen-Kassel soldiers would say, our skirmishers are the ones out there kind of engaging in this active war. We want to keep the order and discipline of our formed bodies so they don't get broken on the battlefield. So it's this method of trying to marry the solid battalion with the skirmishers, again, almost in a Napoleonic way. That is the German answer to the tactical problems of the revolution.
Great, thank you. And one wrap-up question here. 3 key takeaways from your book. Go.
Sure, absolutely. So I would say I'm very proud of this idea of negotiated authority, which has been used by many historians in the civilian world, looking at even like camp life in the British Army, court-martial proceedings. I'm really looking in this book at tactical negotiated authority. What happens when the officers and the men have a disagreement on the battlefield? How do they work out what to do? That's something that my book gives new. I'm also very pleased by sort of the start date. So often we tell the story of 18th century warfare as the story of Frederick of Prussia, Frederick the Great, and his sort of large titanic wars that began in 1741. Well, by taking the story back into the War of Polish Succession, you're seeing a time when it was the norm on both sides to maybe fight in this more flexible way. And so by doing that, I think you have a better window of this 50-year period of 18th century warfare. What else did I enjoy in the process of this? Using and looking at the way how the soldiers were motivated, particularly in the Prussian case, what their social background, their village life, they're loyal to the king. Their religious identity is also very important to them. They're devout Lutherans. They're singing hymns on their way into the battlefield. And so trying to match together these tactical practices with the social world that, sort of they spring from, I think is a great advantage of the book.
Fantastic. Alex, thank you so much for coming down and speaking for us.
Thank you for having me.
Greatly appreciate it. Thank you all for coming in person and tuning in with us virtually. Get home safe. See you next time.